Now we're going to have a panel, a very interesting panel, which will open by my either asking a question or giving a panelist an opportunity to say whatever they want to say briefly. Meanwhile, we're getting feedback. We're going to have all kinds of other questions coming in, and it will appear on that screen, they will, and I will then, for the rest of our time, ask questions off of that. But I want to introduce a truly remarkable group of people, especially if given what's going on in the world today. I mean, if you look at what's happened since the beginning of the Arab Spring, what's happened in Egypt, why the young reformers there weren't represented in either of the succeeding governments to speak of. If you look at what happened in Ukraine, where a massive peaceful protest led to the fall of a government, and under the Constitution, 82% of the Ukrainian parliament voted to impeach the guy. Nobody voted for him, and yet President Putin said he was run out in an illegal, unconstitutional process, the remedy for which was an unconstitutional referendum in Crimea. If you look at this, wait, I'm being serious here. What you see is, for all of the thrall in which we find ourselves with high technology, with scientific research, with all the fabulous things that are being discovered both in particle physics and astrophysics, everything that's going on today, an enormous amount of the world's current living arrangements are determined by old-fashioned military power and old-fashioned identity politics, in which our differences are far more important than our common humanity. Most of you live in a world in which you like your differences and they make life exciting and interesting, but you think our common humanity matters more. Every day we see an unfolding drama which shows the consequences of which side of that debate you come down on. So we have a remarkable group of people for various reasons who can shed light on it. First of all, welcome to the stage the founder of Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation, Jimmy Wales. Thank you. Still a Harvard undergraduate, member of the class of 2016, the grand prize winner of the first Google Global Science Fair in 2011 for her work on drug resistance and ovarian cancer, one of Glamour magazine's 21 Amazing Women of the Year, who wants to pursue a career in science and medicine and push for better science education for all. Shri Bose, welcome her. In May 2011, Manal Al-Sharif filmed herself driving a car in her native Saudi Arabia, where women, as we all know, are prohibited from driving. She posted the video on YouTube and attracted immediately 12,000 fans to a Facebook page. She later did a lot better than that. When she took a second turn at the wheel, she was arrested. After 9 days and a groundswell of protest, she was released. She is an information technology consultant, a columnist, a blogger, a writer. She remains active in the women's rights movement, but she got out there on an issue that for most of us looked like small potatoes, but in Saudi Arabia and in big chunks of the Arab world is a very big deal indeed. Please welcome Manal Al-Sharif. And finally, a good friend of Hillary's and mine, although we permit him to deny it at election time, the senior senator from Arizona, a graduate of the Naval Academy, a man who spent well over 5 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and yet who got over that and was absolutely fundamentally pivotal to my ability as president to normalize our relations with Vietnam, to get an answer on what happened to the unaccounted for prisoners of war, to help us to build a new and different world, and many of whose dreams, like mine, are often frustrated by what we see in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, in the Syrian civil war, and in the streets in Ukraine. Please welcome Senator John McCain. So, where are we on the driving front, girl?
I drove from the Grand Canyon.
You did? Good for you. What's the status of play in Saudi Arabia now?
So with the Arab Spring, I think the Saudi government is going really all over the place, and they're putting more pressure on Saudis in Saudi Arabia, coming up with the last one, the anti-terrorist law. And that includes even movements like our movement, Women to Drive, is implicitly considered a terrorist now movement because it's trying to take the ground or change things in the society. So it's really going bad now.
Let me ask you just this, and I'm going to weave this into what everybody else will say later, but laying to the side a moment the particular struggle. One of the things that struck Hillary when she talked about this before, into Tahrir Square after the beginning of the Arab Spring in Cairo, was that so many of the young people there acted like they were uninterested in participating in the grimy work of ordinary politics. And it struck us all over again. It is much easier to use the social media or even real live physical protests to bring something down than to build something up. So in the vacuum that existed after President Mubarak's fall, first moved the Muslim Brotherhood government, and because they were not inclusive, then came the military. So how do we get more people to do what you did, to try to take a politically relevant act, even if it takes years to bear fruit? What's your advice on that?
So social media around the world is used to get to know people, get in contact with your old friends, while in the Arab world is to start revolutions. Because we have oppressive regimes that you cannot connect with people. And suddenly we have this platform where we can talk. I have a profession. I'm not into politics. I'm not interested at all into going to and run for an office if this is open in Saudi Arabia. And most of the young people or the revolutionaries who started the revolutions in the Arab Spring, they're totally not into politics. So you go and talk to them. Okay, you started this thing and you brought down a whole regime. What's your next? We're not organized. It's more of a grassroots movement. And I think it is a huge problem for us because once you organize something, if you are considered part of organized movement, you are targeted to be in jail for life. This is, like in Saudi Arabia, for example, is one thing. So what we're doing is we're doing it this way. It's just trying to make unrest, trying to shake the ground under the system or the government to change things. But what is next, this is really a dilemma right now, which I have no answer for that.
Jimmy, yesterday, the Prime Minister of Turkey shut down Twitter.
Or tried to.
Tried to.
Yeah.
What does it mean? What happened? What do you think it means that President Abdullah Gül, publicly, the Turkish president, also a member of the Prime Minister's party, publicly disagreed with him? where are we on this? I started talking about the limits of the social media to affect positive change, but it's still a staggering instrument of potential. So what should we think about Turkey right now?
Well, it's really interesting because the explosion in response to that blockage of Twitter has been phenomenal. Several things, they've had record numbers of tweets originate from within Turkey, up by about 134% by one number that I saw, because people are learning very quickly how to get around that block. In fact, I read one story, somebody said, oh, just do the same thing you did when they blocked YouTube a few years ago. The young people know how to do this. I even saw, one of the most amazing pictures I've seen, graffiti during an unrest and uprising doesn't usually, traditionally, have instructions of how to change your DNS settings so that you can get around the block. They were posting IP addresses of servers you could connect to so that you could get back on Twitter. And this is a country that loves Twitter. And of course, most of the people using Twitter, what's interesting about this, most people using Twitter aren't using it for political purposes necessarily. They may follow a politician or two if they like them, but they're following, rock stars and chatting with their friends and so on. And so this kind of really blunt block like this is massively backfired. And it's got people talking about Twitter and talking about the government and talking about freedom of speech in a way that affects them personally. They just wanted to post a picture of their cat or something, and now they can't. And so these kinds of tools of free expression, the point I'm trying to make is that we used to think about freedom of the press, and we thought about the proprietors of a handful of major organizations who were publishing newspapers. And so if you restrict the freedom of the press, it's very damaging for ordinary people, but it didn't necessarily affect them that day. And sometimes it's not even obvious how it's affecting you. Just some stories that you would have read didn't come out and so on. This kind of censorship, where you try to directly stop people from talking to each other, affects everybody, affects ordinary people, and they really get it in their mind. It really makes a huge difference. So I predict they're not going to continue with this. What form not continuing this will take is, of course, yet to be seen. But I think that very soon Twitter will be back up and running in Turkey.
Can I add to what you said? How many here have Twitter? In Saudi Arabia, proudly will do this. One Twitter account is for the public and one Twitter account for our personal life, or to say things we cannot say and the government will take us in trouble. In Saudi Arabia, we are #1 nation in the whole world in tweets. Yes, we tweet the most, and you can go online and read about it. And also the YouTube video per capita, where we beat the US and Brazil. We're #1 per capita on YouTube views. So these social medias are huge in Saudi Arabia. And last week, celebrating 8 years Twitter, they started firsttweets.com. Did you try that one? It's just you put any account, and it shows you the first tweet that account tweeted. It was very surprising to me. Most people following me were sending me their first tweets in Saudi Arabia. It was the time I was in jail. They opened their Twitter account to follow my story and to talk to me. That was amazing. So this is how huge it is.
Mr. President, could I mention everyone?
Sure.
Everyone has their experiences with Twitter and tweeting, and after the passage of Obamacare, I received, there was a tweet from a person named Snooki, and it said, because part of the Affordable Care Act was the raising of taxes on tanning beds.
On what? Tanning beds.
Taxes on tanning beds. And I don't know how familiar you are with Snooki, Mr. President, but she tweeted I'm so mad at Obama for raising taxes on tanning beds. Senator McCain would never do that because he's so pale.
Oh, I'm not going there. Anyway, I want to ask one serious question of Sri, then I'm coming back to you, John, on another issue. You know, when I was reading your story, I thought to myself, this is inconceivable. This woman's not even going to graduate from college till 2016, and she's already won this big science prize, and she wants to do all this stuff. That's fine. But here's what I know about the United States, for example. We have a big shortage in the STEM fields, as you know. It's one of the reasons I favor immigration reform, and I think people ought to be able to get a green card if they're skilled in a certain area. But wait. But we know demographically if women and African Americans and Hispanic Americans went into these STEM fields at the same rate that Asian, Middle Eastern, and European males do, within 6 to 8 years, there would be no shortage in the STEM fields in America. So my question is, how do we get more people to do what you've done and to believe that they're smart enough to do it? How do we do that? And what can we use, how can we use the social media to say that you don't have to win a prize as an undergraduate to still make a meaningful contribution in these areas?
So I first of all, wise words by Stunky. That is a really tough question, and it's one that, as I've been able to travel around and speak to students who are excited and passionate about STEM, I've realized that there's sort of a disconnect where at a very young age, students start to think that science is something that's untouchable almost. Like, it's too hard, I obviously can't do that. And for me, I think I was very lucky in that I grew up in an environment where I never realized that there were these disconnects. I had an older brother who was a great mentor, and I think I just never realized that there was a difference, really. So how many of you guys took standardized tests when you guys were in elementary school? Okay, all right. So you know there's that section where they're like, okay, put down your demographic information. So for some reason when I was in elementary school, I didn't know what I was, so I would always put down that I was white, which isn't quite right. But I reached this point in middle school where I was like, oh, I guess I'm Asian. I think I'm Asian, maybe. And I realized I didn't fit into sort of the stereotypical idea of Asian that I had in my mind. And I think it's almost the same thing with science, where I just never reached a point where I realized that there was a difference between being Asian, being a girl, being a young person in science. I never reached that point where I was like, I shouldn't be in science because of these factors in my background. And so I think one of the things that we can do as a community, as a society, to really encourage more young people to go into STEM is really to enhance the sort of science education that is out there. Because we're reaching a point where we have this technology, we have Wikipedia, which I have to bow down for the number of papers this guy has saved my butt on. Feel me? But we're reaching this point where we have this technology, but we have to bring the sort of education that we use for science up to date with that technology. We have to make science educational accessible to the point where people all over the world can look at it and be like, this is something that's really just cool. It's not something that's I don't understand. It's just something that I think is amazing that I want to pursue. And I think that's what can lead to some incredible things.
Now, I'm going to ask Senator McCain what I think is kind of a hard question. Then we'll go to the questions being tweeted in. You and I first talked about the potential of looming problems between Russia and its neighbors when you honored me with a call when you were a candidate for president in 2008. You remember that, when you called me and you said, look, I know you're on the other side, but we need to talk about Georgia. And were the Russians going into Georgia? Are they going to take part of Georgia? And it's very interesting to me when I was thinking about the way you described the reaction of the Saudis to the Arab Spring. There are, this whole set of problems in a way are rooted in identity in so many ways. So the Ukrainians didn't demonstrate, the Maidan movement was not anti-Russian, it was against corruption and abuse of power within Ukraine. I know a lot of those people who supported the reform movement. My foundation handles the AIDS program in Ukraine. I have literally never met a Ukrainian who wanted to be on hateful terms with Russia, who wanted to have nothing to do with Russia. Look at the map. It's not possible. Forget about the gas. It's just, what they said was, why do they want to control us? We want to be a bridge. Why can't we be friends with Europe and the United States and with Russia? Why can't we bring the two together? Why can't we build a shared future? So we're looking at Syria, which is in some ways more complicated. And you and I have talked about this a lot, but in Syria, President Assad started shooting these demonstrators. They weren't violent in the beginning. And yet, people thought he had, in a way, what you might call a more representative autocracy. That is, there was a place for the minority groups in Syria if you played ball with his crowd. And as soon as the Al-Qaeda and some of these other these outside groups got in, they said that those of us who were supporting an end to his regime ran the risk of having a worse version of what happened in Egypt, where you have the opposite group get in and be just as exclusive. So what do we do with that? How do we translate all this energy that you see from idealistic young people in demonstrations and in the social media? How can we use it to organize against the hard power that is crushing life and liberty in Ukraine or Damascus or anywhere else? What do we do? How can we resolve this?
Well, I thank you, Mr. President. And could I first say thank you and Secretary Clinton and Chelsea for coming here to one of the finest institutions in the United States of America. We're very grateful that you and the Clinton Global Initiative are here. And if there's ever an example of continued service to the country, when he could be back down in Arkansas relaxing, probably catching catfish or something, is our president, who continues to exercise leadership throughout the world. Could I take you back, Mr. President, and maybe some of our students don't recall, there was a situation in the Balkans, in a country called Bosnia, and the Civil War went on, and it went on and on. Americans at that time were very war-weary because of the memories of the Vietnam War. And then there was a place called Srebrenica, where 8,000 Bosnians, men and women, were, quote, ethnically cleansed. In other words, they were taken out and murdered. President Clinton decided that we had to intervene. And we did intervene, and we intervened with the use of American military. And today, Bosnia is not a perfect place, but it certainly is a country that has a chance for freedom, economic development, and all of the things we want for all countries. It took a lot of courage for President Clinton to go against some members of his own party, which never wanted to get involved, and members of my party who were isolationists. And I will always be grateful for the leadership he showed there. We have a situation that's similar to that today, in that Americans are still war weary because of Iraq, because of Afghanistan. And we see a slaughter going on in Syria that is horrific. It's beyond description. We see this situation in Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin has basically now taken a part of a sovereign nation. And I won't go into all of the history of it. But I guess that, none of us want to send American troops in to try to resolve either or any of those problems. But our nation is a unique nation. America is a unique experience. The 20th century was called the American century because we sent our young people all over the world and expended our blood and treasure, and usually in defense of somebody else's freedom. And we made a world in the 20th century and now into the 21st that is really remarkable, in that we have largely achieved a relatively peaceful world with all the challenges that we face. There's one principle, I think, that's involved there, and that principle is our values are our interests, and our interests are our values. When we have young people like this who stand up for their country women and their rights and suffer for it, when we see young people in the square in the Maidan, 110 of them were killed by snipers from government buildings in the Maidan, then we have to stand up for them. We don't always have to stand up with them bombs and bullets, but we can stand up for them, for our values, which are our interests. It is in our interest to see a world that is freer and more democratic. It is not in our interest to see a world where radical Islam now spreads all across the Middle East and North Africa, people who eventually want to come here and do bad things to us and want to absolutely subjugate women to their radical Islamic view of their Koran. So America's going through a very difficult time now, and I believe that the people of Ukraine want to be part of Europe, and they don't want to be part of Russia. And finally, could I say, the President and I think we understand Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is not a Democrat. He's an old KGB colonel, and Vladimir Putin wants to restore what was once the Russian Empire. And so he went into Crimea, which is the home of the Russian fleet, and now he's on the borders of eastern Ukraine. The President and I were just talking, what will Putin do now? I don't know. We don't know what he's going to do. But we know he has the military in a position where he could go into eastern Ukraine at least, and he's threatening other small nations in the region. So we in the United States must care about these people, whether they're dying these horrible barrel bombs that are being dropped in Aleppo and Damascus, or whether it's people now who are being imprisoned and beaten in Ukraine. And so if America stands up and shows Vladimir Putin that we will be steadfast in our defense of these people, then I believe that it's less likely for him to move forward with his desires to restore the old Russian Empire. So, Mr. President, I thank you for your leadership in 2 terms in office where you had to make tough decisions, the most difficult decision that any commander-in-chief has had to make, and I think you made the right decisions.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just say, I want to go to the panel, the questions submitted via Twitter, but for all of you younger people here, I want to just make sure you understand the difference. I believe in a shared future. I never wanted America to dominate anybody. When we stopped the killing in Bosnia and later in Kosovo, I invited the Russian troops under President Yeltsin to be part of the peacekeeping because I never wanted their Slavic co-religionists and people who identified with them psychologically to think that we were going to step on them the way they had stepped on the Kosovar Albanian Muslims or the Bosnian Muslims or the Croatian Catholics. I wanted this to go forward together. This identity thing, I'm telling you, all of you young people, you've got to deal with this. I don't want any of you to reject who you are. You don't have to reject your faith, your ethnicity, your gender, nothing. But you got to decide whether the only way you can win is for someone else to lose. Because that's basically what's at stake in Ukraine and what's at stake in Syria. And that's what you have to decide. Now, I'm gonna read as many of these questions as I can, and you guys answer them quick as you can. For Manal, who will run for office and represent young people in the Arab Spring countries if you and other young people don't?
As I said, it is a dilemma. We're not into politics. We're not interested in politics. Most of the revolutionaries I meet, I follow, and they follow me on Twitter. We talk about these things. One of them is a dear friend of mine who's in prison now. He's a proofreader and a writer. He told me, I want to go to the street or the square, protest. I want this corruption to end. I want to go back home to my job, to my family. This is us. So we are not into politics. One of the very difficult parts that we don't have any awareness when it comes to politics. We're just learning what is civil rights, what is human rights. There are things I had no clue it's my right in my country. And I got to learn about them because of social media, because of trying to read and approach out of the things we've been told.
Well, as I said, Hillary told me when she went as Secretary of State to Cairo and walked in Tahrir Square, she had talked to huge numbers of young people that said the same thing you did. But the problem is, the only organized alternative was the Muslim Brotherhood. They won the election as we knew they would, and then they made the same mistake their predecessors had. They didn't have an inclusive government. Nelson Mandela, who died last December and was a great friend of our families and a friend of the world, put the people who put him in prison in his government. People who kept him in prison for 27 years, he put them in his government. So that's the only point I want to make. Somehow we have to find an inclusive operating model that is adapted to all these countries where all this trouble's coming. Okay. Next question.
Could I just make one additional comment? Part of it has to do with the economies of these countries, because if young people don't have jobs or opportunities, I think you would agree, it's very important that we do whatever we can to help economies in these countries where the majority of the population are younger than 21.
I agree with that. I mean, we have a number of students here from Greece. For most of the last 5 years, their youth unemployment rates exceeded 50%. So I think you're right. For any panelist, the importance of STEM programs is invaluable, but where does humanities education fit in? Jimmy, you want to answer that?
Well, I think it's actually of critical importance, and I think one of the things that I see at Wikipedia, and we can see it in the numbers of what people are reading and learning about and studying across all age groups, but amongst young people, if we have an idea of young people that they're not interested in politics, we're probably making a big mistake. They actually are interested in politics. They may not be interested in running for office. They may be cynical or not believe that they can, and of course, if you're very young, you probably can't run for office yet. You have to mature into it. But I think it's critically important when we think about all of these revolutions. It's quite easy, as you said earlier, to go and tear something down, and it's harder to build something up. And the tearing something down part, we've gotten pretty good at that. You take the right moment and you tweet the right things, and you get 1 million people out somewhere, and you demand change. But there's a deeper thing, and I think this is the type of audience, right? The kinds of people who've come from all over the world, including Arizona, to be here because they're interested in these kinds of issues. And we see, I'm sure a few of you have read a few things in Wikipedia. And that's what you have to do. You have to get educated, and it's education about, economics, game theory, political science, political theory, understand the different constitutional structures around the world, and understand, how did it happen? How did we not have the right checks and balances in our country, not my country, but in whatever country you're thinking of, to prevent one side from becoming so dominant and so forth. So it's really, really critical, this humanities education piece. And you, in many cases today, you have the tools available to you to do that for yourself if you're not doing it in a formal program.
So I'd just like to add a little bit to that. I feel like that I'm mostly from the STEM side of things, so I see an inherent value in STEM, and I often forget to mention that I have many friends at Harvard who are in the humanities, who I've seen working incredibly hard, and what I've learned from them is really that the place of humanities, like the place where it thrives, the place where I think it impacts the most people, is how it helps us understand not only our culture, our society, as it is right now, but also in relation to how everything has been in the past. So I'm actually originally I grew up in Texas, and I'm going to school in Boston. So it's a major culture shock for me to travel between these two places and to see these two completely different attitudes of different people. And I feel like one of the most important things that humanities does is documents those two different opinions, those two different places in history, and makes that accessible to the world. So in terms of humanities education, I feel like we're reaching a point where a lot of our education is becoming things that come out on Twitter. Like, if it's not cat pictures, they're about these revolutions, they're about these attitudes that these people have towards the world. And I feel that as our society progresses, humanities education will progress, and I feel like a lot of you in the audience today will have a major role in shaping how humanities is also taught in the future, which is pretty exciting.
Here's the next question. Can millennials convert their energy for change best through trying to change policy, government policy, or markets? Should they try to do it in the private sector or the public sector? I might add, or through the NGO sector. That may, in Manal's case, where she couldn't run for office because there's no democracy in Saudi Arabia, you might have to do what they're trying to do in China, and with some significant success in some places, which is to try to organize non-governmental organizations to begin to make these changes. But on the other hand, you can make a lot of changes in the market if you're allowed to. So who wants to comment on that?
We don't have NGOs in Saudi Arabia. It's banned by government.
You don't have a what?
NGOs,
Yeah, I
no
know.
civil society.
But if we could talk them into doing that, I think you get that before you get to have a truly powerful parliament.
Well, I mean, I think for every individual, of course, you have to answer this question for yourself based on your own talents and strengths and whatever opportunities life opens up to you. But I do think that we should think not just about traditional paths, politics, NGOs, business, but today we can think about looser. So in Saudi Arabia, you can't necessarily form an official nonprofit organization to agitate for change for the right for women to drive, but you don't need to anymore. You used to need an office and a printer and and papers that you would mail out, your newsletter, and so on. Now you just go and you start building an organization, build a community online at very low cost, and in such a loose and open way, you don't need permission anymore. And that's a major change in the world. That's both exciting and scary, depending on what you're organizing for. But it is definitely, there is a huge opportunity for people. And a lot of the people who do that are going to be, young people who are familiar with social media and who can also do that and move into politics based on a community of supporters they've built online in a completely non-traditional way.
All right, next question is, ask Manal, but anyone else might want to answer. How could you empower women to seek information access without stigmatization or dependence?
You wanna- Go ahead. big words. So in Saudi Arabia or around the Arab world, I don't know really the case here in the West. We have free access to internet. Although they said you need mahram. Mahram means guardian to access the internet. We ignore that. But it's more of, you can't just access and read someone else's experience. You need to read your own environment and your own culture and your own nation experience. So coming from a religious and a very conservative society, women don't speak up. So we encourage more and more women to talk about the unspoken, because that would encourage other women to share their information or to share their stories and really empower women. And I'm writing my book now, and I think it's the first time a Saudi woman go this crazy and write her own story, her personal story, which would give the other woman the opportunity to look into that. It's not easy, and to go through, some people see only the success. You only see when the guy, he holds the golden medal, and you don't know all the painful process he had to, or the painful path he had to go through until he reached there. And in Saudi Arabia, they always put these beautiful, nice, successful women in the front of the press, but this is what the government wants everyone to see. But what about the other women who are simple? I'm just a mother like me who is not in the important person in Saudi Arabia. What is their stories? I think this is the one that really empowers women in the Arab world. Not only, I was in Cairo and I attended Change Your World conference by Yahoo, and I was really surprised sitting on the table, on the panel like this with Yemeni, Syrian, Egyptian ladies, and I'm hearing my story, but in different countries, and how we can share these things together to empower women. Never underestimate the power of sharing a personal story. This is it.
Let me ask you something. Obviously, in order for you to be able to give this answer, and other people like you to give that answer if they live in the Uyghur region of China, or Tibet, or any place where people are worried about internet access and freedom, we have to keep a free and open internet. Are you at all concerned? I understand why the reaction in the rest of the world to the Edward Snowden declarations has given new energy. Wait a minute, listen to this. Given new energy to the idea that the United States should not be in nominal control of domain names in the internet. I understand that. But I also know that we've kept the internet free and open, and it's a great tribute to the United States that we have done that, and including the ability to bash the living daylights out of those of us that are in office or have been. We've done that. And a lot of people who've been trying to take this authority away from the United States wanted to do it for the sole purpose of cracking down on internet freedom and limiting it and having governments protect their backsides instead of empower their people. So are you at all worried, Jimmy, that that if we give up this domain jurisdiction that we've had for all these years, that we'll lose internet freedom?
Yeah, I'm very worried about it. I mean, this is something that when I travel all around the world.
You all understand this issue? Yes. Yes? Okay.
When I travel around the world, I meet with people in many different, internet policy people, government officials, and so forth. It's something that through the years, when people would say, maybe young activists in Germany would say, oh, it's terrible. Why should the U.S. have this special power? And I said, well, in principle, I understand what you're saying. However, there is the First Amendment in the U.S., and there is a culture around free expression that's so strong that it's really important. And for me, one of the biggest disappointments and one of the biggest difficulties right now, if I go to China, as I've done, and I meet with the officials there who censor the internet, and I say to them, you're on the wrong side of history. You shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be spying on what your people are doing. You shouldn't be. They now point and say, well, look what the U.S. is doing. And whether that's completely fair or not, depending on the details of the revelations, that attitude has shifted so that now going out and saying, yeah, but the U.S. will do a good job, people don't believe that necessarily anymore. They're really concerned about what does that really mean, which means that that movement for more multi-stakeholder control, which is a very abstract phrase, and something in principle we can say is good. But when I'm on a high-level panel at ICANN discussing these issues, and one of the things that really concerns me is some of the other people on the panel, and they talk about, well, it's important that we have respect for local cultures. Okay, I respect local cultures, but I'm not sure if that means, I think you, the head of the telecom regulation unit in a particular country, should be banning parts of Wikipedia. That's not local cultural variation that we should embrace and accept. That's a human rights violation. And I don't know the way forward. Internet governance is a very complicated issue, but it does concern me. I mean, Hillary Clinton has had this wonderful, she made some wonderful speeches about internet freedom agenda and so forth, which, really I think had a big impact, and it's really something that the U.S. should be taking leadership on. And if, because of the embarrassing revelations, we're not able to take leadership anymore, I think the world is possibly a little worse off for that.
Yeah, all I can tell you, John, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this. All I can tell you is whatever you believe about what the NSA has done, what the proposals the president made to change it, whatever, the internet has flourished in freedom, and people have had access to it. And whether it was trying to keep access open in Iran after their disputed election with the Green Revolution, whether it's trying to make sure you could use it and people could follow your struggles in driving. We've been there on that, whatever else you think is wrong. And all I'm saying is I understand in theory why we would like to have a multi-stakeholder process. I favor that. I just know that a lot of these so-called multi-stakeholders are really governments that want to gag people and restrict access to the internet.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to mention the other aspect of this that we have been wrestling with as a nation and a Congress, and that is, especially in light of Mr. Snowden's revelations, I believe that it was not necessary to listen in on the telephone conversation of the leader of the Federal Republic of Germany, Angela Merkel, nor the president of Brazil. And so the question that we're wrestling with, and by the way, there are not a lot of members of Congress that are well-versed in a lot of the technicalities of it as you are, is where do we respect an individual's privacy? Where does that end? And our desire for national security and our requirement for national security begin. That debate is raging right now, not only in the Congress, but across America. One of our senator from Kentucky just gave a speech in the last couple of days, one who would like to be president of the United States, saying that basically we've got to stop all this surveillance. And frankly, I can't give you an exact answer. One reason is because technology continues and capability for eavesdropping and gathering intelligence continues. And by the way, Mr. President, thank you for mentioning that I ran for president. After I lost, I slept like a baby. Sleep 2 hours, wake up and cry. Sleep 2 hours, wake up and cry. But on a serious note, I would argue that a lot of the young people in this room are more aware of this issue than many members of Congress. And we need to have a Congress and a president who will try to address this issue, because right now there was a poll recently that 53% of the American people believe that the government is listening in on our phone conversations, and they don't like it. And I understand why they don't like it. So we're going to have to really do work as a government and a people to understand that there is a significant threat out there. There still are people that want to come to the United States and get on an airplane and blow it up. There's still people that are plotting as we speak ways to do that. But at the same time, the fundamentals of our democracy are certain constitutional rights, and those have to be maintained. And if I had a message to you today, get involved in this discussion, because a lot of the future of our country and our ability to preserve our constitutional rights and our nation's security rests on the outcome of that debate.
And
go ahead.
It's so important, and it's so incredible. I mean, one of the things that I think, love him or hate him, I love him, but Snowden, that he has opened this debate. A lot of this was going on without the public really being aware or having really considered it. And we do have to make some very difficult decisions, because we do need national security. We do need spies checking up on some bad guys. At the same time, we want our privacy and our freedoms. And so I think for everyone, you should really get involved. And one of the ways to do that is maybe slightly a little uncomfortable if you're not a technical person, but learn a little bit more than you have before about the technical details of how the internet functions. You don't have to be an expert to start to have some better ideas about what's possible, what's a good idea, and so forth.
I completely agree with that. And we all have our different perspectives about that. The only point I'm trying to make is, I think we've got all this stuff out in the open now. We're going to debate that. And it ought to be debated in an open, transparent way. But because of what happened and what is perceived to have happened, there is a lot of support for people about America giving up the domain control and putting that under some multinational organization. And I just want all of you to know that at least to this point, whatever you think our country's done wrong, the United States has been by far the country most committed to keeping the internet free and open and uninterrupted. And a lot of these people who say they want multi-stakeholder control over domain names and internet access, what they really do is want the ability to shut down inconvenient exchanges within their own countries. And so we have an obligation, maybe even a heavier one because of the problems of the past, not to let that happen. Now, let me go into the next question. It was for Manal, but I think you might all want to talk about it. This is very interesting. I'm not sure there are increasing stereotypes about Islam, but there are stereotypes and then there are real types. So the real question is, can you explain, and can anybody else explain, how it is possible to be a Muslim and an advocate for women's rights? She might say, how is it possible not to be an advocate for women's rights? Go ahead.
Thank you for this question. It's a very courageous question. Anyone saw Non-Stop, the movie? Yeah. The guy with the kufiya and beard who boarded the airplane, and they were looking for the terrorist or the hijacker. I'm like, no, not again, not another Hollywood movie with stereotype about Muslims. And yay, he's a doctor who's saving lives. That was a huge relief for me. And it does bother me a lot. There is a lot of increasing stereotypes about Muslims, and Islam is the new enemy now. By the way, the aggressive radical Muslims are minority, but usually the minorities who are aggressive are very loud. I don't think 10% of Saudis are radicals, the ones that you see on TV, la, 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 and they want to kill everyone and they want to bomb. We're very peaceful nations. The biggest Muslim nation is Indonesia. Have you ever heard anything bad coming from that country? Yes, I'll shout out for you. So it is hurtful, really, and I think Hollywood is doing a lot for that. Hollywood is a global thing. People go to Hollywood movies all the time and watch, and the terrorist is always Muslim or Russian. One of these two. It is painful, but what we do as Muslims, we're just really peaceful people. And Islam, if you read about it, it is on the side of women all the time. It's all the interpretation that came with time that changed these things. If you look I have a very interesting, I lived in Boston for 1 year. There was a very interesting picture of a woman running in the marathon 40 years ago, only 47 years ago. The referee was pulling her out of the marathon because she's a woman, and that was 47 years there are people here who witnessed that. So there was discrimination even in democratic countries and very liberal countries against women, which is still until today. Here in the US, I read Sheryl Sandberg, the last book, Lean In. It's a really good book for women to read. I was really surprised how the similarities are. She said, I sit in a room, because she's a technical person, she sit in a room and she's the only woman in that room. I've been through that for the last 12 years as a woman in my own country. So it is happening here in the US. So why we tie it always to Muslims and Islam and
What about?
Can I just add last thing? And if I go and speak to people like you out of my country, doesn't mean I'm ashamed to be Saudi. I'm really proud Saudi woman. I'm proud to be Muslim too. And I'm not here, to make you feel, I was in the last event in Los Angeles, and the lady, after she presented my story, she's like, this is now we feel how lucky we are to be Americans. And I'm like, I'm not here to make you feel lucky. I'm here more, when you listen to other people's story, it's more to reflect on yourself. We were in Grand Canyon, there was a reserve. Have you heard of Navajo? It's a tribe here in Arizona. And I brought it with me, actually. So this is a wind chime. And it was made by one of the Navajo tribe here. So maybe we reflect on ourselves too, here in America. Any natives in the house? You see, this is why you hear other people's story, to reflect it in your life, to reflect it in yourself, not to feel lucky. Yes, thank you.
Sharif, we kind of skipped over the hard question when you were talking about how you grew up in Texas and you had a brother that helped you and you never really were self-conscious about the fact that women were less likely to be in the STEM fields. And you've done great things. But the fact is that it's a huge problem. So what can we do to fix it? It's a huge problem. It's part of this identity crisis that we have all over the world. People are confined in their, it's very hard to do what you cannot imagine. It is much easier to do what you can visualize yourself doing. So you've got a great imagination. So pretend that you had to overcome this. What can we do? What should our strategy be? I'm just telling you, we have every year 120,000 job openings for people just with computer science degrees. We only have 40,000 computer science graduates in America. That's very little. We're not talking about people doing the kind of scientific research you've done. What are we going to do to overcome the gender and cultural barriers we've got to fix this? Our whole future depends on it.
So I wish that we were at a point where I could say that being a girl in STEM is no different than being a boy in STEM. I wish we had reached that point. And I think there are two main things that not only you as students out there or just people, just our society in general can do. First of all, is to be more open to mentorship. I think one of the things that really got me excited about this field and really got my first foothold in research was the fact that I went out and found a mentor. And she happened to be a woman, and I was incredibly inspired to continue this work because of her. And the other thing I will say is something that's not just, I think, constrained to STEM. I think it's something that can be said for literally anything that anyone is passionate about, and that's to be proud. It's to be proud of who you are, where you come from, what you believe in, and that's really easy for me to say sitting on this stage, but it's something that takes a lot of courage, and I think Manal is a living example of that. I mean, it takes courage to sit behind the wheel of a car in a society that doesn't accept that. It takes courage to be a prisoner of war. It takes courage to go out against all of the challenges of a new society and create a resource for everyone. And I think what all of these, I think so. Do I got the right?
I'll speak to that in a moment.
All right. I think what all of these people have in common is the fact that they stuck to their convictions. They were proud of what they were doing, what they believed in, and they went online, they went out, and they found a community of people who believed in them. And I think that if you, as a girl excited about science, who's feeling all of these pressures because we still are in a society which does not accept that completely, I think the best thing you can do is really go and find that community, because it's going to be colleagues who will encourage you, who will inspire you, and who will make you do better science, better education, better recording of life, better anything that you're passionate about. And I think that's really the best sort of advice I can give to sort of overcome all of the barriers that we've put up for so many years. Be proud.
So,
I'm gonna. Did you want to say something?
yeah, I just wanted to say, I was once given an award of some kind, and part of the description of the award was about courage, and then the person who introduced me said just this kind of remark, and I was just suddenly struck by, you know, I'm an internet entrepreneur, and I live in a very safe place, and then I get, you know, I had some success, that's great, so I get invited to sit with President Clinton and Senator McCain and so on. The courage in Wikipedia is the young man in Iran who was reported to the police because of something that he had written, and he was living with his girlfriend illegally, and he was terrified about that. And later on, they got married, and later on, he was reported to the police again for something. And his wife had my cell phone number because I said, well, what do you want me to do if you get arrested? And he said, make a big noise. So his wife was going to call me. He didn't get arrested, thank goodness. We had a Wikipedia volunteer who just about 3 weeks ago was killed in the Ukraine. He was marching in the street, and one of the snipers got him. And he was marching, and he's a kid who wrote about quite ordinary, normal things, but he saw something, a chance to change the world, and he went out on the street and did something. That's real courage. So I won't accept that I've done anything courageous. I just typed on my computer a lot, you know. So.
Well, you have certainly empowered millions of other people to be. It's no small matter. I want to make one brief insert and then give Senator McCain the last question. We were talking, you did a really good job talking about how the rest of us had to get over our stereotypes about Muslims too. And Chelsea, who I wish she were doing this panel now, because she's been on the board for many years of the biggest interfaith student group in America at New York universities, headed by an imam and a rabbi. And she helped to produce a little film on their work together. It's amazing what they've done. And they take Jewish and Muslim and Christian students out, and they work in disasters, they work after Sandy, they do all this great stuff. But the main thing they do is just get rid of all their stereotypes by living together. And again, the thing that bothers me about what happened, the way this whole Ukrainian thing is playing out, is we've totally lost the real story. The real story is, as John said, these young people in Maidan who were, you know, they just said, we want our country back. They didn't say we want to hate Russia. They didn't say anything. They said we want to live in a certain way. And so I think that's important for you all to remember. Now, you got to ask a question, Senator, which I thought was interesting. With the influence of social media, does politics still end at the water's edge? You all know what that's an ancient phrase. You know what that means? The idea is that, well, the way I used to live it was nobody's supposed to criticize the president when he's overseas. But the idea was that we tried to have a, insofar as possible, common policy beyond our borders. And it really is, since there's no real difference between foreign and domestic policy anymore in so many different ways, it's a very good question. Does that idea still have any power over people younger than we are, John? It still does matter to us, I think.
I believe it does. In fact, there were 8 of us senators who just came back from Ukraine, and we met with everybody that we could there, and you can imagine how moving it was to us to meet with these people, particularly the families of those who had been killed by snipers in the square. And we had a press conference just before we left, 8 senators, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. There was probably 50 cameras there, and we spoke in a unanimous fashion to the world's media, and that there was no division amongst us. Now, when we came back, and this debate is ongoing as to how to handle this international crisis, and by the way, there are many experts who will tell you this is the greatest crisis since the end of the Cold War, then we have different views. But I think the overwhelming majority of those of us in the Congress understand that it doesn't do America any good to go overseas and have a fight and amongst each other or against the President of the United States. Now, there are various meetings around the world and conferences and stuff where you have exchanges, but I believe it still ends at the water's edge. We still only have one President of the United States, and I think a lot of us are very aware of it. And could I say, my friends, my favorite book that I read when I was a very young man is a book by Ernest Hemingway called For Whom the Bell Tolls. And that is was one of the most popular books ever written. And the title is taken from a poem by John Donne, and it ends up, ask not for whom the bell tolls, someone dies. But they toll the bell, it tolls for thee. And I think that that is something that has always moved me very deeply. We are part of humanity. What's happening in Aleppo as these barrel bombs are falling on these young people? What's happening in eastern or Crimea, where people are, whether they like it or not, are now going to be part of Russia? What is happening in many places around the world is part of us. And that doesn't mean we go fight every battle. It doesn't mean we send American troops. It doesn't mean that we put anybody in harm's way. But it does mean that we stand up for these people. Time after time after time after the Cold War was over, they came out and said, he spoke up for us. They listened to Voice of America. They had secret radios. They listened to the voice of freedom and opportunity, and they still want to be like us. So if I had a bit of advice from an old man, it's involve yourself in public service. There is nothing more ennobling than serving a cause greater than your own self-interest, and the world needs you today.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think we have heard from 4 truly remarkable people. And I want to thank them all. And if you want to be involved with them, I urge you to be in touch with them. And I'll see you on time in the morning. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you.